Just want to make sure that we're all live. Awesome. I can see that we're live. So good evening, folks. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. We're just going to take a couple minutes, let some more people join us on the live. I'm looking at our numbers right now, hoping that they go up. And in the meantime, just send this around to folks you might know who might be interested in this conversation. Looking forward to what's going to be productive and engaging. Awesome. So while that goes around to people who might be interested, I want to welcome you to the Campaign for Community Control. And I want to thank you again for joining us for our third live listening session. This is currently being streamed live, but this video will also be available not just right now, but after this video is complete, it will be on the Campaign for Community Control's website. I'll be sharing it across LinkedIn. And you're welcome to share it as well. If you haven't visited the campaign's website, it is createcommunitycontrol.org. So feel free to look that up, and you'll see not only this live session, but all the other live sessions that we've done to date. So while we spend a couple minutes waiting for our folks to pour in and join the live session, allow me to introduce myself. For those of you who do not know who I am, my name is Imani Yassin, and I am your host tonight. So I'm a native Baltimorean, and I'm working in housing and community development. And then I also lead the Campaign for Community Control. In addition to my work at the campaign, I'm also the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Parity. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Parity, Parity is an equitable real estate development company, and our mission is to acquire and renovate vacant and abandoned properties by the block in order to create affordable homeownership opportunities. But back to the Campaign for Community Control. So the campaign is a citywide, multidimensional effort that engages our larger community in the quest to address Baltimore City's vacant property crisis. We do that through a number of different educational offerings like these. We do it through engagement, and we also do it through advocating for legislation and policies that support measures of community control of land and property. So we utilize a reparative lens in our work, and we acknowledge the history of land dispossession, of racial discrimination in housing, and wealth extraction in order to inform our pathways towards a brighter and truly more equitable and just Baltimore City. So our first order of business as a campaign has been pushing to establish our city's very first community-directed land bank. And there are several ways for folks like yourselves who are on the call to get involved in that campaign. The first thing you can do is sign and share our petition, which I'm going to go ahead and drop here in the chat, which is there now. The second thing you can do is volunteer, right? We cannot do this work alone, and we need all of you, all of Baltimore City, to get engaged to not only establish a land bank, but really to create the opportunity for community to be at the forefront of decision making as it relates to what happens to their neighborhood, what happens to their properties. So if you want to volunteer in support of the campaign, I'm going to drop a link as well to our contact page on our website, which is going right here in the chat also. It's a little too big for this, so let me make this smaller. There you go. It's createcommunitycontrol.org, and then you can click contact at the top of the page. The third thing you can do is stay connected with us. You can follow us on Instagram. We have a TikTok as well, which you can find with the handle at createcommunitycontrol. I'll drop that also. But the last thing is host a learning session. So if you would like to educate your community, if you're a community organization that has a lot of people you engage with, feel free to host us for an in-person or virtual learning session that can provide folks who are associated with your organization with insights to the purpose, the benefits of land banks, to community control measures, et cetera. We'd be happy to do that, and that is a big part of our mission. So before I welcome our illustrious guest, I want to start with how I always start, which is with the background on the true implications of neighborhood vacancy in the city of Baltimore. So As many of you know, many of you are practitioners, community organizers, or you may be new to this conversation. Either way, we know that Baltimore City has a long history of racist housing policies, land use decisions, investment practices, and simply ways of operating that have resulted in inequities that continue to affect communities and community members to this very day. One of the symbolic legacies of racist housing policies, land use decisions, investments, and practices is the existence of thousands of vacant properties and lots throughout the city. And the majority of those properties and lots exist where? In Black communities, leaving Black communities and neighborhoods carrying the inequitable burden of all the issues that are related to vacancy. So here's a couple quick facts to bring you up to speed about the issues of neighborhood vacancy. First, according to a 2020 report by the Able Foundation, approximately 16.4% of all residential properties in Baltimore City were vacant, which makes our rate of vacancy considerably higher than the national average. The second is that vacant properties, as I said before, are to no surprise concentrated where? In historically Black and historically redline communities. A report by the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance revealed that neighborhoods like Sandtown Winchester, like Harlem Park, and Middle East had a diminished tax base to support community had concentrations of vacant housing that in some cases exceeded 30%, which doesn't only create a diminished tax base that supports community resources in those areas, but also serves as an extremely negative contribution to all of the social determinants of health. Third, research consistently shows that vacant and abandoned and deteriorated properties also reduce the value of surrounding properties, which decrease home equity and personal wealth. One example is in Cleveland, Ohio. Properties within 500 feet of a vacant, tax delinquent, and foreclosed property lost about 9.4% of their assessed value. Four is that according to the cost of vacancy, which is a report that was completed by Mary Miller and Mac McComas of the Johns Hopkins 21st Century Initiative, states that between lost tax revenues, lost water and sewage revenues, the cost of maintenance, demolition, and more, vacant properties cost our city around $200 million each and every year. And then last, vacant properties are also associated with poor health outcomes, poor states of well-being, poor educational outcomes, and the list goes on. So we know that this issue isn't new and it isn't small. And for me, in my perspective, it is the connective tissue that many of our other city issues are connected to. And it's the driver behind our desire to establish our city's first community-directed land bank. So for those of you, again, who might be new to this conversation, let me tell you a little bit about what a land bank even is. A land bank is a public entity that has unique powers to put vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties back to productive use according to community goals. Currently, there are over 300 land banks and land banking programs that have been created to return blighted properties back to productive and community serving use. A land bank's primary purpose is to acquire properties that some call blighted and temporarily hold and take care of them until they can be transferred to new and responsible owners. So now that I've painted that backdrop of the city's issues as it relates to vacancy and also explained what land banking even is, I want to give the context that today's conversation is going to be about leveraging the power that land banks can have with utilizing measures of community control. Communities should be at the forefront of the decision-making about what happens in their own neighborhoods. And so today, we're going to invite our guests to talk about different strategies to actually create community control in action and drive true and just equitable outcomes. So without further ado, and less talking from me, I'm going to go ahead and invite our wonderful guest, Crystal Okafor. Hey there, Crystal, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Give me a second to rename myself.
Awesome. Your name certainly is not Garrick.
So Garrick is a trusted colleague and friend. Hi, Garrick, if you're with us tonight.
Shout out to Garrick for letting us hold your Zoom. We appreciate it.
All right. Hey.
Yay. Wow. Okay. Awesome, wonderful, and welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Likewise, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I kind of started off this conversation in the call with talking about what the campaign was, some of the issues as it relates to, vacancy in the city of Baltimore, and then also talking a little bit about community control of land and property. So before we get deeper into the last part of what that conversation is going to be, I would love it, which I always ask our guests, is if you could just introduce yourself, tell us about who you are, and then tell us your Baltimore story.
For sure. Thanks again for having me, Amani. So, hey folks, my name is Crystal Okafor, pronounced she, her, hers. I am the Director of Policy and Planning at Share Baltimore, which is a network of organizations that own and develop land for the benefit of the community. Our membership of six is primarily community land trust, and I'll say a bit more about CLTs later in the conversation. But there are these nonprofits that are engaged in primarily the development of permanently affordable housing. And they do that with community governed boards. So neighbors and strangers come together to decide what gets built where. And that's a beautiful example of community control of land. I myself am currently, of course, living and working in Baltimore. I first came to the city in 2012 when I was a Baltimore City mayoral fellow, and I was exposed to a lot of the organs that help the city run, some good, some bad, and I decided to stay. I lived in Baltimore from 2013 to 2015, and then I started making my way up the East Coast to finish my education. So I worked for the city of Philadelphia on housing and homelessness while getting my MSW. And then I moved up to New York to get my JD, and I did a lot of organizing and work there around housing and land justice issues as well. So I have about 10 or so years of experience in urban and social policy, primarily related to housing issues. And it's been great to bring my experiences, my lens back to Baltimore, and ensconce myself in this grassroots community of advocates and activists who really understand land as power. So that was my Baltimore story.
Awesome. So, in other words, you are a expert, and we are blessed that you to have you here and share your knowledge and expertise. So, thanks for that backdrop. But to kind of jump into, and let me look in the chat and see who else might be here on the call. Let's give some people some shout outs first. So I see Sarah. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for letting us know that you're here. Shout out to AH. I can't see what the name is there. Tiana, seeing you in the chat. Make sure that as you, okay, she's a Baltimore resident, future Harlem Park homeowner. Grateful
Nice.
that you're on the call. Continue to share this link out with folks. But want to kind of jump straight into this really important conversation about community control of land and property and how community can really be the decision makers about neighborhood outcomes. So my
Mhm.
first question that I have for you, Crystal, is one, can you talk about kind of the history, I guess, from a policy perspective of community control of land and property, and then also speak to how can we ensure that communities have a greater say in decisions regarding land and property?
Sure. So for me, I think that the history certainly does not begin in the 1960s, but I think for our purposes, that's a good place to start.
Mhm.
Because in the 1960s, you really see Black leaders articulating a vision in which land ownership, especially collective land ownership, is this cornerstone of self-determination for Black communities. And self-determination, cujit taglia, that's always been
Mhm.
a foundational value for Black folks on the left. There were people like Malcolm X who articulated that land is the basis of all independence, land is the basis of freedom, of justice, and of equality. But there was also projects like Fannie Lou Hamer's Freedom Farm Co-op, where she brought together a cadre of neighbors and strangers to own land and farm land together to free themselves from abusive sharecropping arrangements. Black folks have always seen land ownership as an opportunity for us to confer collective security to ourselves, that security that we haven't had through due to the ways we've been antagonized by the state and to a certain extent the market. We can also sort of cite the history of community control of land in urban development in the 1960s. So During the 1960s, the federal paradigm for urban redevelopment was that federal agencies would directly channel dollars to these quasi-governmental organizations that were charged with engaging in redevelopment. And these organizations are quasi-governmental in that they are somewhat like a city agency, but they lack the transparency and accountability measures that a city agency typically has. And since their leaders are appointed, their leaders can't be voted out with a mayor. Their leaders are typically sort of ensconced from the voting cycle, so they have a lot of power. So imagine the federal government is giving these independent agencies tons of money, and they're doing it
Mhm.
such that they can engage in urban renewal, the wholesale clearance of um, undervalued real estate in cities, clearing those neighborhoods, priming them for redevelopment. And this undervalued real estate typically tended to be low income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. Um,
Mhm.
but as the decades sort of progressed, the federal government began to, quote, get out of the housing business. So there was some retrenchment. Their budgets shrunk. And now cities like ours are competing for private investment. Think of something like the Amazon HQ2, where Amazon was
Mhm.
looking for where to develop its new offices, and you had city governments throwing property tax abatements and other just giving away their
Mhm.
emptying their public coffers for Amazon. So that's the sort of paradigm now, and that actually means that community members like us have a bit more leverage because since the city government is weaker because they can't depend on all this federal money coming in, community members have a bit more leverage. We can negotiate directly with developers through things like community benefits agreements. So we have a bit more say in the process than we did in the past. And I want to give a special shout out to law professor Sheila Foster, who's
Mhm.
written and researched a lot about this change in urban development and how it allows for community members to enact various community control schemes that we'll be chatting about tonight. Um,
Awesome.
on your second question about how we do
Mhm.
community control, that's a very good one. And like that's the meat and potatoes of our talk.
Mhm.
In our land bank working group, we've been talking about policy and institutional design.
Yep.
Policy tends to be a bit more fluid and flexible. It a policy for something like a land bank would be passed by its board and it can be changed at any time. Institutional design, governance, these are the rules of the road. Ensconced in legislation, harder to change. For us, we definitely want to see a disposition policy that enacts a racially just transfer of property. Disposition is a term we'll probably both use a lot tonight for folks watching this. Disposition is just the transfer of property. It could be a sale, it could be a grant. And we want a disposition policy that is racially just. So we want to see it prioritize and subsidize the transfer of property to individuals, small developers, nonprofit developers, community groups in neighborhoods that have borne the brunt of Baltimore's
Mhm.
racialized dispossession, displacement, disinvestment. And then on the institutional design front, the governance of the land bank, we want to be weaving community control into that. So we want to think about this menu of options, these tenures and tactics that allow for community control. Things like community benefits agreements, community planning, community ownership, advisory boards, environmental review, and a sixth one that I think is important that I haven't yet mentioned to Amani, which is moratoria.
Oh,
That's
you're
something I wanted
gonna
to lift
do
up
a
for this group.
surprise.
A surprise wonky land use topic, yes, but it's a good one. And I think it's one that's going to resonate with people who are in lower income neighborhoods because it's something that has been used to address a policy issue that I've faced when I lived in one such neighborhood. So I think it'll resonate with folks. So yeah.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you for that. That was a very robust kind of journey through the beginning until where we are today. And so, for where we are today, we have a land bank legislation that would essentially establish Baltimore City's first land bank. It hasn't, been passed hopefully yet. But wanted to talk about that. Can you speak to how maybe institutional design strategies or what role policy design can play and just generally what's possible in Baltimore's land bank enabling legislation?
For sure. I think a lot is possible. Our land
Hmm.
bank has the unique opportunity to return resources and power to Baltimore's most forgotten neighborhoods. I'll say a little bit on the legislation. I know you already have Amani, but in the legislation as written, there are 2 seats on its 11-member board for residents from high vacancy neighborhoods. The land
Hmm.
bank under legislation will have its quote equitable disposition process. And the disposition, again, the transfer of property, that will happen according to the best outcomes for the neighborhood. So not merely who the highest bidder is or the best outcomes for the market, but ideally the best outcomes for the neighborhood. The land bank will not have eminent domain authority under the current draft of legislation, which is big because we know that eminent domain has been used to antagonize Black folks in the city. Um, and in the case of large scale disposition, the land bank's leadership must provide notice to the requisite community association and host one public meeting. All of that is good, but all of that is merely consultative. That is seeking the
Hmm.
non-binding feedback of community members. That is not control, which is decision-making authority, the topic of tonight's conversation. So we do need to think about some alternate strategies to ensure that community members are empowered by the land bank to decide what gets built where. There are many ways to do that. And I think that on the policy front, the disposition policy that governs how we prioritize and subsidize the transfer of properties to those various actors I referenced in
Hmm.
Baltimore's marginalized, formerly red line areas. There are so many ways to do that. One that I think is a national best practice that I think is rather potent and a model for us is the Portland Affordable Housing Preference Policy. They are prioritizing households with generational ties to neighborhoods that experience the root
Hmm.
shock of urban renewal. So if you have generational ties to a neighborhood that was cleared for urban renewal, or your household was actually, your family was actually forced to move from a neighborhood that where urban renewal took place, then you are prioritized for affordable rental apartments in Portland for first-time home buyer down payment assistance. Top priority in under the Portland policy is given to households and descendants of those households who owned property taken by eminent domain. This is
Hmm.
the sort of restorative policy that our disposition, the sort of restorative measure that our disposition policy can include. But when it comes down to community control, I'd love to see some institutional design measures that I'll get
Hmm.
into further in my remarks. So.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind with the generational ties is also folks who may have been renting properties at the time. At the
Yeah.
time, I wonder what their policies are, state about those folks too. Because the very first thing that popped into my mind when you said it was like my generational ties to places that are no longer existent and now
Yeah.
have different structures. Let's just say, Giant on 33rd Street, that was a row of houses. And,
Mm.
so wondering where, if that exists yet for people who may have been renting or people who may have been living there but didn't own, but still have every right to be there. What measures might be in place so that they can have an opportunity to live affordably or to own property there as well. So, want to move on to the next question. But there was one question in the chat that I wanted to make sure that I conveyed to you in case you can't see it. Is there's two, and the first was what is a community agreement, and then the second was what is root shock. So I'll let you speak to community. What is a basic community agreement? I think it's going to be one of the institutional design strategies that you that you talk about, but want to
Mhm.
make sure that we immediately address the question.
Definitely. These are excellent questions. So thank you to the people in the chat who left them. And I did want to say, Amani, your comment about generational ties. I think if Baltimore's land bank were to adapt and adopt this practice, we could do that
Hmm.
in a way that was inclusive of renters. So what if you assess generational ties to a neighborhood that faced urban renewal through like school enrollment records? There are a
Hmm.
number of ways to do that. And I think that certainly people who are renting in a neighborhood that was um, James Baldwin said that urban renewal was Negro removal. So if you were a renter and you
Hmm.
were removed, summarily removed from your neighborhood, you certainly have claim to restorative practices, to reparative practices that a city might engage in. Thank you again to the person in the chat with the questions. I'll say that root shock is a term that scholar Mindy Fullilove uses for the generational trauma that comes with being displaced from your land. And she uses it to describe specifically people who have experienced things like gentrification and urban renewal, who have seen their cities remade to their detriment. We've seen city government harness its legal levers to exclude, to dispossess, to disinvest, and now see large industries in their same cities using those same legal levers to remake cities for the so-called creative class and then push out people who have these generational ties. You might experience root shock from something like the demolition of public housing in the 1990s under Hope Six, or something like the urban renewal of the 1960s. Root shock is a term that I think speaks to the violence of urban development that is not regulated in a way that empowers community members to make decisions. And then a community benefits agreement. This is again, great question. A community benefits agreement is one of those strategies that can create community control. And we actually currently have a community benefits agreement active now in Baltimore at the Port Covington, Baltimore Peninsula site.
Mm-hmm.
So a community benefits agreement is a contract. It's a legally enforceable contract between community members and developers. Typically what happens when a developer comes in to remake a neighborhood, to engage in one of these really large scale projects, they'll face pushback from our advocates and from our activists saying, why aren't you building housing that families can afford? Why aren't you hiring local people from the community to build the project for you? You know, why aren't you investing in transit infrastructure? We need an accessible transportation stop in this neighborhood. We've never had one before. And the developer knows that if they don't engage with the advocates and the activists in a constructive way, it's going to slow down the completion of their project. They may not get the approvals they want from city leaders. City council members will feel beleaguered by the complaints of the residents. So to stop that protest, what developers do is they come to the table with a coalition of community leaders and negotiate a contract about concessions that they will give to community groups to sort of curry favor with them and get their support for the project. So in the case of Port Covington, a number of community groups, they're called the SB6 Coalition. They're getting grant funds from the proceeds of Port Covington. So community benefits agreements allow, and this is really empowering residents to negotiate on behalf of themselves and to benefit from projects that typically would have excluded them and not yielded any benefits to them at all. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so my next question for you, Crystal, is can you share any examples, and I think you were about to, about or examples of well-written legislation that specifically and successfully promotes community control?
Definitely.
Where
And
are they doing it right? Because it ain't here yet.
Well, I will say this. They're doing it right in cities across the country, and Baltimore has the community control strategies that I'm going to highlight tonight. Community planning, community benefits agreements, which we've spoken about, mm-hmm. Community ownership, advisory boards and commissions, environmental review, and moratoria. Baltimore has enacted these things in the recent past to a certain extent. Have they been woven into the governance of an institution? Have they been made par for the course? No. But Baltimore has used them to a certain extent. So it's possible for us to do good work here. Where are folks getting it? Where are folks getting it right? I have a few examples that I like. The first one I want to start with is Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is the new example of moratoria. So a moratorium is a prohibition on, it's a temporary prohibition on certain land use. And the reason why I wanted to highlight this is because it really demonstrates what happens when community members are making policy, when they're empowered to do so. So Tulsa passed a 6-month moratorium on the construction of new small box discount resellers, i.e. dollar stores. And this is important because if you lived in the hood recently, you know what it's like to have a Family Dollar and a Dollar General and a Dollar Tree all in the same block, or all within 3 blocks of each other, or all within sort of concentrated within your neighborhood. And when you have that dense concentration of dollar stores, it makes it impossible for a full-scale grocery store to compete in that neighborhood. and it thus transforms your neighborhood into a food desert, a neighborhood without a full-scale grocery store. Because their supply chains are so, the dollar store supply chains are so efficient that they will always have a lower price than the grocery store. So there just won't be a grocery store. So what Tulsa did was pass a 6-month moratorium. It was a Black woman city council member, Vanessa, I believe her name was Vanessa Hall Harper, who led this effort. 6-month moratorium on new dollar stores being approved. She studied the issue during that 6 months, and then she and her team crafted a quote healthy neighborhoods overlay for their zoning code that said that there was a dispersal standard in place such that no new dollar store could be created within 1 mile of another dollar store in Tulsa's food desert neighborhood. So this is a moratorium. So for instance, our land bank is not empowered to use eminent domain, which is excellent. But if that weren't already in the legislation, the land bank legislation could have a moratorium on the use of eminent domain under certain situations. So any noxious sort of land use, a moratorium can stop it. Another place that's getting it right is Detroit. Those community benefits agreements that I just mentioned, Detroit has an ordinance in place that says that if a project is of a certain size, so if it's $75 billion or more in value, if it receives $1 million or more of property tax abatements from the city, or receives $1 million or more of city-owned land for development, then they must negotiate a community benefits agreements with the residents. And the residents who negotiate the community benefits agreements would be appointed by the city council member for the impact area for the project.
Gotcha. Those are great. Really good. I love the Detroit one because we'll talk about that later, but it really connects to what we've been working on in policies and procedures subgroup with the idea of a community advisory panel. But my next question to you is maybe this is kind of I'm going to skip. Okay, so what challenges might there be? So you talked about where they've been doing it, right? But what challenges could come up or maybe have come up, right? When policies for community control, with those policies for community control, is there any pushback or any issues that, we've seen with actually enacting those measures or putting those measures into legislation?
And definitely. I call this section in my notes, haters will say. So the first thing the first thing haters will say, the first thing haters will say is that it's NIMBYism, which stands for not in my backyard. This is actually a legitimate concern that we have to guard against. So NIMBYism, not in my backyard, often when there's public participation processes, more well-heeled members of the community will use those processes for opportunity hoarding. You can imagine a community association in a higher income neighborhood where that community association might have a chance to vote on whether subsidized housing is built. And of course, they'll vote against it because they think that if you bring in subsidized housing, property values will fall. And then they're hoarding their opportunity. They're hoarding their neighborhood with the high paying jobs, the good schools, the beautiful parks. They're hoarding their opportunity, excluding lower income people. The way that we prevent opportunity hoarding and NIMBYism is by being really specific in how we craft our processes. So consider the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund Commission that says that the folks who are on that commission must be people who lived experience of homelessness, must be our fair housing developers, must be people who have some sense of how their professional and lived experience can inform good policy, can inform policies that are racially just and economically just. I want to, if folks are interested in learning more about this, Anika Singh Lamar, she is a law professor at Yale. She's written an article called Over Participation that talks about public participation processes and land use that go awry. So another thing that haters will say that we've talked about is that community control is not from Baltimore. We're trying to turn Baltimore into New York or San Francisco, but that is not the case. As I've already mentioned, we've used community benefits agreements before. We have community planning with the Neighborhood Design Center in Baltimore. We have community planning with community managed plans via our planning department. We have our Affordable Trust Fund Commission. That's an example of an advisory board or commission, etc. So Baltimore has done some community control of land. We just haven't really embedded it to the full extent that it could be. Haters will also say that this is socialism. That, of course, is not the case because we're trying to shrink the power of government relative to the governed. So we're trying to give more power to the people. We're not trying to make government bigger. Haters will say that community control isn't law. These are merely advocacy strategies. This is pork barrel. In actuality, this is really substantive law. Amani has seen the one pager I have where I list out all of these strategies. And in that one pager, I link all of the statutory language for each. I link statutory language about how community planning is being used. I link statutory language about community benefits agreements, about citizens advisory panels that are dictating the disposition of land. So we know that this is all legal. This is not merely advocacy work. I think I'm trying to see. I don't know how many of my haters do I want to shout out.
All of them, because you know they watch it. No.
So I'll say that haters will say that Baltimore's land bank legislation is already equitable enough. I mentioned some of the provisions that are in it. These are good provisions. Um, the land bank in Baltimore was designed by legislators who believe in equitable development. But Crystal would say equitable according to whom? If the land bank ordinance does not follow the lead of Black leaders in Baltimore, Black leaders at the grassroots who've been demanding control,
Mhm.
and the legislation instead requires mere consultation, is it really equitable? Who has the authority to define equitable development in Baltimore? I would argue that it's our Black leaders in the Black Butterfly, and what they want is community control. Um, Haters will also say that a land bank has the potential to be a land bank with community control at the fore could be dilatory. It could slow down processes. It could slow down development. I think that is unlikely to happen because with the reform of the in-rem process, we're expecting to see um, an accelerated pace of development in the neighborhoods that are have the majority of our 15,000 vacants. And the last thing I'll say is haters might think that since I work for the city's community land trust network, I have a hammer, so I believe that every problem is a nail, and that isn't the case either. I don't think that every solution is a community land trust. In fact, I think that we have a menu of tenures and tactics to advance community
Mhm.
control. So, for example, with our land bank, community control could be impaneling a community advisory board with representatives from the Black Butterfly with decision-making authority over the disposition of property. Community control could be requiring a community benefits agreement whenever there's a large-scale property disposition. Community control could be requiring a racial impact assessment on how large-scale property disposition and the resulting redevelopment might change neighborhood character and disproportionately impact communities of color. Community control for the land bank could also mean a private right of action, a right to bring a lawsuit, such that community members can enforce any participatory measures in the land bank ordinance. There's a menu of ways you can do community control, not just community land trust. I'll stop
Mhm.
there.
Absolutely. So one of the things that you were saying in your response that stood out to me was the bureaucratic, nature that can be created with implementing measures of community control. I'm of the mind that you would rather do something slowly and correctly than to do something quickly and incorrectly. So want to hear your thoughts around that because that's something that has been in the conversation and in the air around, even the creation of a land bank is that folks do not want another entity that creates more bureaucracy. So just wondering from your perspective, and then we also have to hold that while properties sit vacant, while properties sit abandoned, that is a burden on neighborhoods as well. So just
Mhm.
thinking about those two things and balancing, what are your thoughts around how quickly this work needs to be done versus the importance of implementing measures of community control?
I think this is a great question. And I think the potential for sporadic government processes for delay is one of the more legitimate things that haters will say.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's necessary for us this is very urgent work. We know that there are a number of harms that households who live in these neighborhoods face just due to their proximity to vacant properties. And we want to be um, working hard to move the needle for them. But I would also say that it's important to move at the speed of trust. We know what happens in government when decisions about redevelopment are being made in a quick manner, are being made behind closed doors, are being made by actors who are not accountable to people of color, decisions are being made about us without us. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
the small bit of delay that's needed to ensure that residents, especially the residents who are most impacted by these issues, have a chance to weigh in. that small bit of delay might be justified. Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to run for
Mhm.
president, she was a member of Congress from Harlem. She used to say that if they don't give you a seat at the table, you need to bring a folding chair. And I think that's what we need to do
Mhm.
with this land bank. And often in movement, we say that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
is incumbent upon us to design processes that allow us to have our say. And that bit of process, I think, is worth the wait. It's worth that little bit of delay.
Okay, so we have two quotable captions that you just shared. The first is they will make decisions about us without us. That's number one. The second
Mm-hmm.
quotable was if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're gonna keep those. That's it's giving hashtag for sure.
Yes.
Um, absolutely. So, um, the next question I have for you, Crystal, and I just have a couple more before we kind of engage with folks in the chat, is what steps can folks like, like us who really care about this issue, who really want to see measures of community control, what steps can they take, or organizations who also would like to, kind of get involved, don't know how, what steps could they take to advocate for kind of policies and legislation that would promote community control, or some of the institutional design strategies that you mentioned, whether it be in the land bank or elsewhere?
This is a great question, Amani. I think that our work is of critique and political imagination. Often, those of us who are on the left, who are in movement, or folks who are in the community, we know how to critique. We know how to say what we don't like. We know how to get on Twitter and light people up.
Mm-hmm.
We know how to yell at the press conference. But do we engage in the work of political imagination? Do we engage in the work of institution building? Do we say, this is what I believe government should look like? I know that some of us have tried to do that and have been told no, or have had doors closed in our face, or have people say to us, government can't work like that, or that doesn't make sense, or that might be good for movement. That's not good for government. And I would push back and say that this movement towards the institutional design of community control is one that is rebuilding government in the image of social movement. So again,
Mm-hmm.
you need to bring that folding chair. You should have a seat at the table to dictate how government works and ensure it works to your benefit. This is not merely, this isn't the reforming government from the inside. This is rather what you see Cooperation Jackson doing, where they're building their own CLT and they're building their own business cooperatives, but they're also going to government to ensure that their people have what they need. You can be someone who is electrified by work of the grassroots and then rebuild government to make it do what you need it to do to ensure that we have a fair distribution of benefits and burdens in our city. I would encourage folks to be in conversations like this one. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
the conversation that Amani, you and I had this morning with a cadre of developers, attorneys, advocates, activists is indicative of what needs to happen. Adrienne Marie Brown, the Black feminist, she says that there's a conversation in this room that only the people here at this moment can have, and that it's our duty to find it. And I believe that that's how we make change. We have people with different vantage points, different perspectives, not the usual suspects, but people who really share values. And we're doing the tough work of trying to build institutions that we know will be fairer and more just for our people. So I would encourage folks to be in touch with you and find avenues to be a part of these conversations and to not shy away from conversations that can be very technocratic and wonky. If you hear a term that you've never heard before, they're using terms like that to try to intimidate and exclude you. Look that term up and then stay at the table, stay in your folding chair. So
Let me tell you, there's been many a times and many a conversations with Crystal folks where I have had to look up a whole bunch of stuff, look up everything. So I completely agree. I completely agree with that. And it is important because a lot of times these conversations happen, outside of our view and even in our view over top of our heads. And so it can be
Mhm.
really intimidating and daunting for people to just engage and to share their voice. So one of the other questions that is just a organic kind of generative question is, what do you think about the city's responsibility to create the foreground or opportunity for community control? I think that, when I talk about community development from a reparative angle, I'm always talking about how Baltimore has led racial discrimination in
Wow.
housing. And so want to flip that over to you with given what we know about that. what do you see as the city government's responsibility to ensure that community control actually can exist in mass?
Definitely. I think the city of Baltimore has a responsibility to pilot community control in the same way that it piloted racial zoning in 1910 and became a national example of how to constrict the mobility, economic and physical, of Black people for the country. So we piloted the evil stuff. Let's pilot the solutions that have the opportunity to make repair for that. I think that I alluded to this um, to the remarks I'm about to make earlier, because on Friday, Amani and I were in a meeting with the full land bank working group. It includes a few folks like us, younger Black folks who are really values driven, who are working as developers and working as policy advocates, and even some activists too. But the lion's share of the folks in this room are older white folks who are leading some of Baltimore's more august institutions, whether those are in government or in philanthropy, et cetera. And we had I'd say, somewhat tense and stilted conversation about these topics. And it's interesting to me because the land bank legislation as written references, quote, equitable development. But when
Mhm.
we brought to the table ways to really operationalize, to put into practice community control, this some folks in the working group bristled. My thought is, who deputized these folks to define equitable development for the people of Baltimore? Shouldn't the definition of equitable development in Baltimore be the priorities of the Black leaders at the grassroots? When I came to Baltimore, I was really impressed by the work that Nika Namdi of Fight Blight Be More was doing, and
Mhm.
others to spur a movement for community control of land. Shouldn't the definition of equitable development be in Baltimore be
Mhm.
written by leaders at the grassroots, not by the dictates of technocrats and wonks and folks who have deputized themselves um, as the experts, as the leaders, as the final say. I think the city has a responsibility to pilot community control because that's what the leaders of the grassroots say they want. Like that, that alone is enough to compel the
Mhm.
city to at least devise strategies to try. And if we identify the ills of NIMBYism, if we identify the delays that can hinder a successful participatory process, we can then work to reform it. But merely the fact that there is consensus at the grassroots is enough for the city to have a responsibility to implement community control if they truly believe in this equitable development they've been talking about.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. We have a great question in the chat from Sarah, and I want to read it out loud and then I want to answer it before I give you my last question, Crystal. And Sarah's question is, how do community groups join the campaign? Are there meetings where the language of the legislation is continuing to be drafted and changed to move from community consultation to control? First off, thanks for the question. Secondly, community groups can join the campaign by first and foremost going to the contact page on the link that I listed and just sending a contact saying, like, hey, I want to be a part of this group. We do have an ongoing policies and procedures subgroup that is meeting to suggest changes to the legislation to make sure that the legislation can move from community consultation to control. And so, in your like contact form, if you can say, I would like to join the policies and procedures subgroup, I can follow up and send you an invitation to be a part of that conversation. So thanks for asking that question. I think it's a great question. And that goes for anybody else, whether you want to be a part of helping draft the legislation, whether you would like to share our petition to establish the first community directed land bank, whether you just want to share out or you have another suggestion for a live session, please drop it below or hit us on the contact form and we will respond. The next question that I wanted to ask you, and it's my last question on my list, is about political imagination. And so when you look ahead and when you get into your own mind, Crystal, about the future of Baltimore from a community control of land and property standpoint, what steps, if you could break them down into just 4 to 5, like bullet pointed steps, what steps do you think we need to take? And what is in your dream mind's eye?
Oh wow. It's
Yeah.
this is a tough question because I'm being both asked about my dreams, but then also asked about this short bullet pointed list.
So maybe
I
start with the dream and then go to the list if that makes sense.
I think my dream for Baltimore is that especially Black folks here who have experienced the harms of discrimination um, and exclusion have get to experience freedom, joy in whatever form that looks like for them. I my I got a lot of my bearings around community control of land and housing during my time in New York. I was a part of the New York City Democratic Socialists, and we were very focused on redistributive policies, things like community land trust that would remove land and housing from the private market and subject it to controls to keep it permanently affordable and governed by residents. When I got to Baltimore and tapped in with folks like you, Amani, and others, I realized that community control here, like there was some room for some private ownership because we want to see our families that didn't have a chance to own a home due to the exclusion of the GI Bill, due to the exclusions that Dr. Brown talks about in his book, um, the exclusions that Ira Katz Nelson talks about in the book when affirmative action was white from
Hmm.
these New Deal programs that created the American middle class. We want to see those households have a chance to own a home. We want to see small developers have a chance to share in the rebirth of Baltimore neighborhoods. We want to see our small investors thrive, and that too can be a part of community control. So my vision for Baltimore would be one that operationalizes community control in all of those ways. So different strategies that allow individual households to flourish, our small developers, our CLTs and other community-owned projects, our community groups. And um, I think I want folks who understand land as power in Baltimore to have an easier go of it. We have
Hmm.
this lovely urban agriculture community, and so many of the folks in that community are politically minded. And they are growing food because they want folks to have access to healthy food. And but they also want folks to engage in a sort of healing from trauma by spending time outdoors. They also want folks to be building the bonds of community by being together um, in this sort of third space. Often what they lack is land and land ownership. Often what they lack is secure tenure. What would it mean? What sort of policy transformation would have to happen for our urban ag community to have the ability to take title to land in an affordable
Hmm.
manner, for our urban farmers to be able to build wealth by owning the land that they farm on, not merely leasing it from the city, but own it and like build that generational wealth. But then
Hmm.
also, what might it look like for an organization like Bolar to be able to have access to non-extractive capital that they can use to purchase buildings? We need a lot more of what Baltimore already gets right. So we need more seed commons, we need more Bolar, we need more Black Yield Institutes, and we need systems in place to make their work easier to do. So.
Thank you for that. So you gave us a lot of tasks that we that we'll get to work on. No, but I just want to say before we close out, I want to look in the chat and give anybody else who's here the opportunity to ask Crystal a direct question, to ask me a question, and I'll just give you folks a couple seconds to drop it in the chat, and if not, then we'll close out. So, any last questions that we have?
One thing I will say is that to the participant who asked, how do I get involved with this work? If you are thinking to yourself, I'm charged up by what I heard today, I want to be at the
Hmm.
table, but I'm not quite sure if I want to be in this policy and procedure subgroup, stay posted on the campaign social media for our public hearing date. Because even if your one intervention here is coming to this public hearing and saying, what I want is community control, I don't want to be consulted, I don't want you to ask my opinion, that I want people in redlined communities to decide what gets built where. Just showing up to that hearing and saying that would be incredibly powerful. Or showing up to that hearing and saying, Crystal listed these options for community control, but my vision of community control is XYZ. That would be powerful as well. So your voice in that hearing could make a lot of change.
Yes, definitely come to the hearing. Feel free to also ask questions. I think that that's another way to get involved is just to ask questions, to stay updated. Share things also is that's the one of the biggest ways to get involved is if there's someone you know who's maybe living in a community with a lot of vacants, or other people who just care, right? Make sure they know about what's happening, what we're trying to do as well. So with that said, I do not see any other questions in the chat. And so I just want to say thank you again, Crystal, for taking the time out of your schedule. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you
But
chose
I'm
to
here
be
with
on
you.
our live listen session. And you chose to, share some wonderful, wonderful things for folks to think about and take home. So with that, we'll close out. Thank you so much. Again, this will be available not just right now, but it'll also be available on the campaign's website, and we will also share it around. So with that, have a great evening, folks, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Amani. Thanks, everyone. Bye.